I'm always trying to get to the bottom of things, and I've really been wondering what's at the bottom of what's been going on, well, for a number of years, but most particularly since I released those videos. Say, one of the things that's really put me in a quandary is why they got so much attention, because there's no real reason for that. You know, I put up videos that I made in my own home, and I was trying to clarify my thinking about a couple of things that I didn't think were laying themselves out properly, and it's turned into a center of controversy, and that means that there's many things going on at the same time, and that no one really knows what they are, because you don't get that much of a flurry of activity around something if the issues are clearly defined. And you know, often if you're having an argument with someone in your own family, the first part of the argument is trying to figure out what in the world it is that you're arguing about. You know, are you arguing about your entire relationship, or are you arguing about the little thing that happened to annoy one of you that day? And it's by no means easy to figure out at all what the argument is about. And so I think the argument basically is about postmodernism. I know that many center-right and right-wing people in the United States have laid the blame for what's happening on the campuses and in the broader community at the feet of the Frankfurt School, and Janice talked about Marcuse, and I think that's reasonable. There's an element of that line of thinking that's responsible for what's going on today, but I think the postmodernists have got too much of a hall pass on this. And the postmodernists, most of them were French intellectuals who had participated in the student movement in the 1960s, and they were Marxists by their own admission, explicit admission. It's no conspiracy theory to associate postmodernism with Marxism. It's nested inside Marxism. And now the postmodernists developed their philosophy in the 1970s because it became intellectually untenable to be a Marxist by that point in history, for a variety of reasons, not least of which was the indisputable revelations of the consequences of communist tyranny in the Soviet Union and in China, which those systems were dreadful beyond comprehension. And you could make a case that that was tyranny of personality. That case was made by people who insisted that the radical leftist doctrines on which those societies were predicated were actually not properly implemented. But I looked into that for a very long time, trying to sort out whether or not that was a reasonable proposition. And my sense was, especially after I finished reading Solzhenitsyn, that it was deeply wrong. And his works, both on the Stalinist period and on Lenin himself, Solzhenitsyn did a very, very careful job of delineating the causal relationship between the fundamental Marxist doctrines and the absolute horrors that emerged as a consequence of their implementation. And very few people know about this now, and that's a great mystery to me. I teach about what happened in the Soviet Union of all places, in my personality class, psychology class, because writers like Solzhenitsyn and Viktor Frankl and Václav Havel and other people like that, Tolstoy as well, insisted that there was a direct relationship between individual psychopathology associated with lying and the horrors that were perpetrated in places like the Soviet Union. Anyway, Solzhenitsyn did a very good job of detailing out the causal relationship between the underlying doctrines and the horrifying laws that were enacted as a direct result of those doctrines. And so I think by the end of the 60s, the basic consensus in the Western world was that line of argumentation was irrefutable, and there was something seriously untenable about fundamental Marxist doctrine. I don't think that pleased especially the French radical intellectuals like Derrida and Foucault, who I think are, well, Derrida, the thing is, I find them contemptible, frankly, but that doesn't mean they're stupid, and they weren't stupid, and they had a point, and in fact they had multiple points, and that's also what makes this war that's going on, ideological war, say, or culture war that's going on in campuses and across the West so incredibly entrenched and so incredibly difficult. The postmodernists basically performed a sleight of hand in the 1970s, and they replaced the idea of economic oppression with the idea of cultural oppression, and they replaced the idea of economics with the idea of power. And they also performed another sort of criticism, which is the deep criticism, which is that the act of categorization itself has an oppressive nature, because when you put things in one category, you exclude other things from that category. And that's Derrida's fundamental idea. And that's actually true, because of course when you do categorize something as one thing, then you categorize all the other things as not part of that class. And you might think, well, that's not particularly surprising, given that that's the nature of categorization. But Derrida takes his criticism further, and he says, well, we make category systems out of values, and then we reward people in accordance with those values, but people who can't act in accordance with those values get marginalized and excluded. And then he says, which is of course true, if you set up a business, the business is directed towards a certain aim, so the business has a certain value structure, and then people who act in accordance with that aim get preferentially rewarded, and people who don't, or who are outside of the domain, either get punished or excluded. And so Derrida's point was roughly that if you set up any system of categorization or any system of value, you necessarily exclude and oppress people. But then he went further, and that's true, that's the thing, that is true. And you can argue, and it's for that reason that if you look at social structures, I would say archetypally, a social structure is represented by two fundamental archetypes, and one is the wise king and the other is the tyrant. And every social structure has a wise king element and a tyrant element. And what happens to the radicals on the postmodern left is that they insist that the category system is only the tyrant. And you can make a very coherent story out of that, because every system by which people organize themselves has a tyrannical element. I mean, if you're going to organize yourself with other people and cooperate with them, you have to sacrifice a certain amount of your individuality to do that by definition, because you all have to act in a manner that's somewhat homogeneous towards a homogeneous goal. And that means that, well, first it means that people who can't do that are going to be excluded, but it also means that all the parts of you that can't do that are also going to be excluded, And when people talk about things like work-life balance, they're referring to exactly that problem. If you're employed in an enterprise, then you're rewarded for your actions in relationship to that enterprise. But all the other parts of your life that aren't devoted towards that it's going to be difficult to maintain them and to operate, to maintain them and to, well, we'll leave it at that, to maintain them. And so the problem is, though, and this is the fundamental problem with postmodernism, I think, is that, and I think this is also the distinction between conscientiousness at a trait level and agreeableness at a trait level. Those are two fundamental temperamental features. Conscientious people are dutiful and hardworking and orderly, and agreeable people are compassionate and polite. And the politically correct people are very high in agreeableness, and they tend to be low in conscientiousness. But the thing is that inclusion is a fundamental value, and it's sort of the value upon which our family philosophies are predicated. That if you have a family, you want everybody in your family to be included, and you want all of them to have a chance to thrive. So there's a real inclusive, temperamentally based set of values that's at the bottom of that. But the problem with that is that without a rank order of values, then you don't have anything to do. You see, and this is what the radical leftists don't get and won't admit, is that people need more than inclusion. They also need an up. They need a place to go to. They need a place to strive towards. They need something to orient themselves in relationship to. They need a value structure. Now the problem is that, so the value structure is actually what gives your life meaning. Because, and I mean this technically, this is a theory, but it's very well supported theory, is that a lot of the positive emotion that people experience, and also a lot of the structure that constrains their anxiety exists as a consequence of their ensconcement within a value system. And so if you don't have an up to pursue, if you don't have a direction to go in, then there isn't anything that you can do with your life, because nothing is preferable to anything else. And that's not a good state. And part of the reason for that, as far as I can tell, is that misery is intrinsic to life. You know, there's no escaping from misery. It's your destiny in the most fundamental way. But what you can set against that is the striving towards a goal. Now, the problem with that is that you're striving within a goal-directed structure. That structure is limited, and it's going to exclude parts of you and exclude parts of other people. And so what you constantly need is some balance between the existence of value structures and the proclivity and desire to include people within those structures. But that's a tension, like it's an irreconcilable tension. And if you blow out the value structures, then everything becomes flat and dead, and all you're left with is your suffering. There's nothing to strive towards, and life doesn't have any meaning. And there's a deep nihilism in this that I think is intrinsic to postmodern thought. And then if you take that too far and your hierarchies become too rigid, then only the people within them are successful, especially only the people at the top, and you generate a lot of misery at the bottom of the structure and then also outside of it. And those are chronic existential problems. They're never going to go away. They're problems that are built into the nature of human social interactions. And you have to keep both of them in mind simultaneously. And you can't reduce your critique of society to one side or the other, because you're missing half the story. And it's like, if you're only looking at half the world, you're going to run into things 50% of the time. And that's not going to be good. And I don't think the postmodernists have grappled in the least with the problem that's embedded in their philosophy, which is that it's a philosophy that criticizes the idea of value itself. Well, that's not acceptable. It's a pathetic solution. And so the other thing that's very interesting about postmodernism is that it claims to refute the idea of any overarching narrative. Now, it's a complex claim, and it's associated with the value claim. A narrative is a story that you tell about where you are and where you're going. And so the narrative contains within it the hypothesis of a goal. And the postmodernists believe that, well, first of all, they believe that any narrative is as good as any other narrative, or maybe even more specifically, they believe that there's no such thing as a relevant narrative to begin with. But then they can't organize their own lives, because there's nothing. And the postmodernists will state this clearly, that you can't extract out a logical or coherent means of existence from postmodernism. But because that's actually impossible, they default to their neo-Marxism. And that's partly also why this is such a crooked game, because even the people who promote the game can't play it. They have to step outside the postmodern game in order to organize their lives. And what they do is they step out of the postmodern critique of value systems into this overarching neo-Marxism. Now, the Marxist idea is predicated on the fundamental assumption that, I would say, that individualistic Western capitalist culture is corrupt beyond redemption, and that it's fundamentally erected to do nothing but benefit those who happen to have the maximum power. And so then you get the racial issue like white privilege, and you get the patriarchy idea, you know, that it's white men in particular who've created this only for themselves, and that all of the processes that are used to support this system, including logic and rationality and dialogue, all of those things are only offshoots of the desire for that small group of power-mad creatures to maintain their dominance over the rest of the world. And the only reason that there's any wealth associated with that is because the wealth was generated as a consequence of oppression. Now, the thing is that that story is partially true, in that every society that human beings have ever created has a tyrannical aspect, and every society has a corrupt aspect. But what the Marxists make a variety of conceptual errors in their critique, I think. And the first is that instead of comparing Western culture to every other culture that ever existed, which is the proper comparison, they compare it to some hypothetical utopia that would be brought about if any given postmodern neo-Marxist happened to acquire the reins of power like Stalin did. And their fundamental implicit claim is, well, what happened in the Soviet Union and in Maoist China wasn't real communism, but if you let me take the reins of power, I would usher in the utopia against which our current society is so terribly terrible in comparison to. It's like, well, our society is terrible in comparison to any utopia, but it's not as terrible as the society that utopians bring about. I can tell you that. And that's something so awful. Then you think, well, what about comparing Western civilization to other civilizations? It's okay, well, go ahead, do it. Do it. Read your damn history and see what you conclude. It's like, for all of its flaws, and there are many, many flaws, there's never been a system on the planet that has brought so much good to so many people in such a short time. You know, as we sit here today, 300,000 more people in the world will have electricity. And we're eliminating poverty in the world so fast you cannot believe it. So in the year 2000, for example, the UN set up a goal that would see poverty halved across the world by 2015, and they actually reached it in 2013. I mean, think about that. In 13 years, it's not even a generation, a number of people who live in absolute poverty was halved. And if you look around the world, the rate at which the middle class is being generated is absolutely unparalleled at any time or place by orders of magnitude. And so, like, what's the problem here exactly? Well, you know, are we raping the planet? Well, yeah, for sure, but it's doing the same to us. And that's the other thing that the radical leftists don't ever consider. It's like people do all sorts of destructive things, and they don't live in perhaps the most harmonious way with the planet itself. But Jesus, mostly what we're trying to do is not die. And, you know, well, really, I mean, good God, you know, think about where we live. It's like, you can't live here. You're bloody African apes, you know. You can't live here. It's too cold. And so from November to March, you're basically staving off freezing to death in a few hours using this vast industrial complex that we've built. And it's like, it's certainly, we pay a price for it, and maybe it's not sustainable in its current form, but it's not like we don't have our reasons. It's not just rapaciousness and greed. And the idea that Western society is nothing but oppressive it's an untenable idea. It's simply wrong. I mean, we know this even technically, because one of the things we know is that although there are prejudicial attitudes that keep deserving people from occupying the positions where they would be of most benefit to themselves and to other people. We know, for example, that if you want to be successful in a Western culture, there's two things that are of great benefit, and one is that you're conscientious, which means you're hardworking and you have integrity, and the other is that you're intelligent, and those are very powerful predictors of success. And to me, they actually validate the culture itself, because you got to ask yourself, is like, who do you want to be successful? And maybe smart, hardworking people are the right people to rise to the top. And that is not to say that everyone at the top is smart and hardworking. Like, these aren't absolutes, they're tendencies. But at least we've got that tendency going. It accounts for about 25-30% of the variance, which means, you know, 2/3 of what makes people rise to the top is still determined by factors outside of that. But you don't have that relationship in the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is, I mean, you really want, how many people migrate away from North America somewhere else? You know, and why is that? Why is that? Well, it's because for all of its faults, and there are many, because people are faulty, and that's wired right into them, for all of its faults, this is as good as we managed to do. And to be foolish enough to let that sink because we're comparing it to some utopia and whose manifestations we have already experienced in the most horrifying possible way is absolutely reprehensible. There's no excuse for it whatsoever. And, you know, I actually think that, so Derrida, for example, called Western culture phallogocentric, and what he meant by that was that it was predicated on the phallus, so that's the masculine patriarchy element, and also predicated on logos, which is, he was thinking about it as the root word of logic. But the criticism is actually deeper than that, because there's an idea in the West that's very, very deep, and it's the fundamental idea in the West, and that is that logos gives rise, logos, which is basically the essence of your soul, that might be the way of thinking about it, is the thing that constantly mediates between chaos and order. And like, this is a very powerful technical claim. A very similar claim, by the way, is made in Taoism. But the idea is that what a human soul does is confront the chaos of potential. And you kind of know that you live like that. You know, you're always trying to realize your potential, whatever that is, and you're trying to realize the potential of the world. So you confront this chaotic potential, and by using your logos, which is your consciousness and your capacity to think, but even more importantly, your capacity to speak, because that helps you correct errors, right? You think and you're full of errors, and then you talk and people tell you why you're stupid, and then maybe you get a little bit smarter. That's really the point. Because when you think, you know, you're still going to be subject to your own biases. But if you speak publicly, then people will tell you in no uncertain details just exactly what's wrong with you and your stupid ideas. And hopefully you can listen and you won't be such a moron the next time you have something to say. But the idea that the West is founded on is that the human soul confronts the potential of chaos and generates habitable order out of it. And that's why the individual has divine status, let's say, in the West. That's why in our oldest books, you know, the idea is that the human being was made in the image of God, because God is also the thing that takes potential and transforms it into order. This is a profound idea, and it's something that the postmodernists, they hate that idea. They absolutely hate it, and that's why they won't do things like engage in dialogue, right? Dialogue is the shared logos. That's the root of the word. They won't engage in dialogue because in their world, your identity is either oppressor or oppressed. That's back to the Marxism that underlies postmodernism. And that's all you are. You're whatever your ethnicity is, or your racial group, or your sexual identity, or whatever identity group they want to come up with, because they can be infinitely fractionated. And you're either an oppressor or an oppressed. And that's all there is to you. Like, you're just a member of a group. And if you're oppressed, then you're good, and then if you're an oppressor, then you're bad. But the problem with that, even though there's some truth in it, because like I could pick out an identity dimension for any of you that you're an oppressor along, and another dimension along which you're oppressed, no problem. But the problem with that is that it doesn't actually tell you what to do. And this is also the problem with the postmodern identity. Identity isn't just who you think you are, and it's certainly not your bloody ethnicity or your sexual preference or anything so stupid. And the reason for that is that your identity is what you use to operate in the world. Like, it's what makes you a functional person, and not only as far as other people are concerned, but as far as you're concerned, but also as far as nature itself is concerned. Like, an identity is more like the toolkit that you use to operate in the world. And, you know, being black or being white or being gay, it's like, that's not a toolkit to operate in the world. At best, it's a shallow description of one dimension of your being. And identity is something that you have to negotiate with other people because they need to trade with you. It's like, you have something to offer, and if I have something to offer, then we can communicate, and hopefully it's good for you, and it's also good for me. We both benefit from that. And that's identity. It's like these ideas that identity is, first of all, subjective whim, which is what's been basically written into Bill C-16. It's like, you know, that's a really poorly socialized 3-year-old thinks that. Is that I'm whoever I want to be and no one else has anything to say about it. It's like, well, try that on the playground and see how many kids will play with you. It's like 0, unless they're forced to, you know. Mom, that person doesn't know how to play. Well, that's okay, Timmy. You go find someone else who knows how to play. It's like, and I mean this seriously, because if you look at the way that identity is formulated among children, what you see is that at the early stages, when they're really trying to catalyze a proper identity, they do that by learning how to play with others. And that means they learn how to cooperate and compete. They learn to play a shared game, not their own damn game. And, you know, one of the things that Bill C-16 basically says is, well, I have a game and it can change whenever it wants, and unless you follow the damn rules, then we're going to bring the full force of the law against you. It's like, what good is that? It isn't even going to help the people that this bill purports to help. It won't help them at all. It's another reason why I object to it, because the damn policies that underlie Bill C-16 are so muddle-headed and idiotic that they even invalidate the arguments that the people who are looking for protection use to validate their own identities. So, for example, lots of the trans people believe that they were born in the wrong body. Well, that's a biological argument, but the law, the way it's set up now, says that there's no relationship whatsoever between biology and gender identity. So that's the end of that argument. No, you can't be a man born in a woman's body, because that's a biological argument. If you think you're a woman, it's just a whim. Well, and that says it in the law. It's like, whatever you want, bucko. It's okay, if it's whatever you want, why should I take it seriously? if you're making a claim, well, I'm a different sort of person, fundamentally, there's, something in my wiring, let's say, something fundamental has made it impossible for me to live in the category that seems self-evident. Well, then you've got some power behind your argument. But if it's just, well, I'm X today and Y tomorrow, or maybe I can change it every hour, how in the world is anybody going to take that argument seriously across time? You want to do the same thing with sexual preference? It's like, oh, there's no biological basis. Okay, then why the hell shouldn't I tell you who you can sleep with and who you can't? If it's just your damn whim. So what kind of stupid law is that? How is that going to protect people who are in a minority position if you reduce it to complete unreality? Well, back to postmodernism, I guess. So, I've been thinking about these sorts of things for a very long period of time, and when I was thinking about ideological possession over the years, I was trying to understand how you orient yourself properly so that you don't fall prey to ideological possession, whether on the left or on the right. And the only thing that I could really come up with after thinking about it was a return to this idea of the logos. It's like, well, you have to be an ideologue if you have no strength as an individual, because you have to default to your rigid group identity and to your group protection, because you don't have a good way of being in the world, and you don't know how to articulate your arguments, and you don't know how to stand on your own. You need that group fostered solidity behind you to give you some courage. Well, that means you're underdeveloped as an individual, as far as I'm concerned. And this is another idea that I think is associated with the fundamental idea in the West, is that there's a dynamic relationship between the state and the individual. And they're both very important because you have to get along with other people, but the individual is what keeps the state's eyes open and keeps the state updated. And in order for that to happen, individuals have to be strong and wise and educated and oriented properly in the world. And so what you do to fight off the temptations of ideological possession, and we better get our acts together on this soon because people are polarizing like mad, is to develop your own character. You strengthen yourself, you get educated, you make yourself articulate, and you figure out how you can stand outside the group when you have to. And that's a lot harder than you think, one of the things I really learned since September, I knew this to begin with, was that, people have this strong tendency to duck and cover whenever they might be exposed and identified, outside the group. It's like the idea that, the flower whose head stands up above all the rest is the first to be cut down by the scythe. It's something like that. And so, what I've really been struck with since I've been thrust into the public limelight, let's say, is how few people will identify themselves and stand up along beside me. Like almost none of my academic colleagues would do that. And it's pretty pathetic, all things considered, even if they don't agree with me, but they won't come out and say anything. And those people are protected, right? They have tenure. It's like there's no more protected creature on the entire planet than a tenured professor. Yeah. Well, it needs to be that way. It needs to be that way because what you see is that even with that much protection, people are still afraid to stand up and say what they think. You think about that. Think about that hard. Because it's not like tenured professors are more cowardly than your typical cross-section of humanity, which still makes them pretty damn cowardly, by the way. But even with that much protection, people won't stand up and say what they think. And so that shows you how carefully the legal protection around standing up and saying what you think has to be in order for that to exist at all. But it also tells you how carefully you have to organize your life so that you can actually say what you think. You have to be standing in a position of strength. You have to be willing to have things taken away from you. And that means you have to have options. And so if you're gonna think and think individually and keep your eyes open and keep the state updated, then you have to be one tough son of a bitch, roughly speaking, because otherwise, as soon as there's any pressure put on you, you'll fold, and you'll fold. And every time you fold in your life, you're going to weaken your soul and make yourself more oppressed, this pathetic word, more oppressed. Of course you're bloody oppressed. It's like everybody's oppressed. It's in the nature of life to be oppressed. We all die. We all have terrible diseases. Our families get sick. It's like oppression is built into the structure. So whining about that is not going to help. The best you can do is try to make yourself into something that's vaguely useful and respectable and capable of articulating itself, and also able to stand outside the group. And that's the call. That's the fundamental call of the West. It's like, strengthen your individuality. Strengthen your individuality. Learn how to articulate yourself. Educate yourself so you're not some flabby pushover. Because if you are, then you're going to get pushed over. And you're not going to like that. You're not going to like that. And, you know, our culture is polarizing like mad. And we can't even talk to each other anymore. And as soon as you can't talk to each other, then you're either a slave or a tyrant. Those are your options. You either talk, or you capitulate, or you fight. And those are the options. And there's lots of people in the wings on the radical left and the radical right who would just as soon we fought, because they're so angry about everything that if it all burnt up in smoke, it would be a great party for them for the 2 weeks they were able to survive in the rubble. So, yeah, well, you don't want to underestimate the power of resentment as a motivator. It's absolutely potent, and a huge chunk of what's driving this polarization is increased resentment on both sides. So think, learn, talk, and get yourself strong enough so you can stand up for what you think is true. That's not what is true, because what the hell do you know? You don't know a damn thing. Everything you say is going to be stupid. But you have to say it in order for it to be corrected, and then maybe you won't be so dumb, and then maybe other people won't be either, and we could muddle through a little longer without having everything fall apart. And so that would be a good conclusion for this. So thank you very much.
Professor, why are so many of your compatriots so cowardly? Do you have an explanation for that?
Well, I don't think it's the right question. I think the right question is, why are people so cowardly? And that's easy, because you can be hurt. And who the hell wants to be the target of a screaming mob? And I don't care how strong you are in character, even if you're narcissistic. If there's a bunch of people who are going after you for being cruel and unthinking for something that you've said, the probability is that's going to rattle you up pretty badly. And then you have a family often that relies on your stability in your position. And before I made the video, one of my colleagues said to me, because we'd been talking about political correctness, and I think this was one of the things that actually motivated me to make the video. He said, look, if I want to stand up against political correctness, I'm going to pay a huge personal price, and the net effect on society will be very small. Well, right, so there's no arguing with that. Well, it's wrong, but there's no arguing with it, right? It makes sense, and it's certainly very likely that would be the case. So, but that doesn't work out, because if everyone plays that particular game and just keeps their head down and shuts up, then the society gets corrupt and tyrannical, and then everyone loses. But you don't have to ask why a group of people are cowardly. That's the wrong question. You have to ask why you're cowardly. And then the first thing you have to do is figure out that you have reasons to be cowardly. It's not just that there's something wrong with you, even though there's lots of things wrong with you. That's not the only reason. It's like everything you have and are can be taken away from you. So there's the explanation for cowardice. It's like, yeah, well, the question isn't why are people cowardly, it's why is everyone ever not cowardly, even for a second? And I would say that that's because they have a certain faith in the integrity of being and are willing to stand up and for what they believe. They do that in spite of their vulnerability. And so you ask why you're cowardly, not why some group is cowardly, because that's just the wrong question. So.
Thank you for your presentation. I especially enjoyed your insights on Jacques Derrida, but I think that you've properly dichotomized this fight for free speech as one between modernism and postmodernism. Where I think respectfully you might err is in saying that postmodernism is intrinsically bound up in Marxism. I think there are several, but many Marxists who are not postmodernists. You could use, for example, someone like Noam Chomsky, who, although he is a Marxist authoritarian, has been pretty consistent in his defense of freedom of expression, even deplorable free speech like Holocaust denial. I would say also that there are postmodernists of the right, people who propagate alternative facts, people that, like David Clement very poignantly said earlier, advance patriotic correctness. So to what degree do you think that a rightist postmodernism does exist? And to what degree do you think it's a threat to free expression?
Well, if you're looking at two philosophical movements, they're rough labels in that they have fuzzy boundaries. And I would say not all Marxists are postmodernists. That's definitely true. I would say almost all postmodernists are Marxists, however, although some of them aren't. But I don't think that the postmodern philosophy can actually survive without being embedded in Marxism, because it just leaves people with nothing. And nothing isn't good enough. There's no rallying cry. Like the mere fact that most of the postmodern disciplines, like women's studies, call for activism on the part of their students indicates that they're not really postmodern, because you can't do that if you're a postmodernist, because you don't have any philosophical grounds for action. It's like you have to say that one thing is better than another if you're going to call people to action, and that's exactly the idea that postmodernism most stringently criticizes. So I think it's inevitable, the nesting of especially activist postmodernism in Marxism. And like with regards to the Marxists who aren't postmodern, it's like, well, stop being a Marxist, you moron. There's already been 100 million people die from it. It's like, what sort of evidence do you need? Oh, well, that wasn't real Marxism. It's like, oh, good. Well, let's try it your way. What's going to happen? Not the same thing that happened to the other 10 countries that turned into murderous regimes. Oh, no, under your guidance, everything's going to proceed to the utopia. It's so appalling, it's so arrogant and narcissistic, that claim, because I know what those people mean when they say that isn't real Marxism. They mean if I was in charge, it would have worked out. And that claim, man, I think that's probably about the worst thing you can say. It's certainly the most dangerous thing you can believe. If only I was in control. It's like, oh. You just have to look at yourself for 2 seconds in the mirror and have some sense to realize what sort of catastrophe it would be if your stupid whims got to rule the world.
I'd like you, if you could, to please address our loss of story, of our story in the West. Narrative is really, really important. And it seems to me the siren song of multiculturalism has taken over. The Western society is based on Judeo-Christian values. That is our story. And I don't have any qualms about saying that, but it's very politically incorrect. So multiculturalism essentially, in the way we see it, has robbed Christians and Jews of our story. It's kind of like, I'm going to slap you down. Any other story. Multiculturalism in Canada has come to mean any culture but Judeo-Christian culture. And I mean, I will, what's the word that I want to say here? My great-great-grandfather was Robert Baldwin, who many people won't know even who he is. But he was one of the founders of government in Canada. He was one of the precursors to Confederation. So, of course, I grew up with him in my grandparents' dining room, pictures of him and William Warren Baldwin, etc. But even that, you know what I mean? If you say that, it's kind of, well, no, you can't say that. Dwems, dead white English European males, forget them. So can you address that, our loss of story? We've been told you don't have a story, or if you do, it's bad.
Well, I would say, look, I've been trying to address that, but it's really complicated. And but
you talked about logos.
Yes, well, I have.
In the beginning was the word.
The course that I teach, mostly maps of meaning, for example, that's online. And I actually answer that question in about 40 hours of lectures. And I mean, it's required.
I know, I brought up a huge topic.
There's a problem with modernism too. And the problem with modernism is that the embeddedness of the idea of the individual is basically embedded in a notion of rationality. Mm-hmm. And that's actually not a deep enough notion. And what I think I've found, perhaps, is I've tried to trace the idea of that logos back as far back into history as I could, and certainly far past the Judeo-Christian tradition in which I think it really flourished, but back as far as the oldest stories that we have. And the story basically is that the human being is an intrepid explorer of the unknown, someone who goes out into the unknown and faces something frightening and difficult and complex and gains something of value as a consequence and brings it home and shares it with the community. Mm-hmm. And that's Jung in particular, Carl Jung, was very interested in that particular archetype, and it's the archetype of the hero, and it's one of the archetypes upon which the West is founded. Mm-hmm. And it's far deeper than mere rationality. And I think part of the reason that modernism has fallen prey to the postmodern critique is because the Enlightenment thinkers didn't understand well enough how indebted they were to the mythological tradition in which their thinking was embedded, and they tended to construe themselves in opposition to that.
Well, they lived off the capital.
Yes, that's
essentially,
right.
of-
That's a good way of thinking
Yeah.
about it. And
That's
that's
what we're
exactly what
doing.
Nietzsche said. Essentially, is that we're still living off the capital. You know, we've killed the golden goose, but there's still plenty of eggs laying around.
Yeah.
And so,
Not so many anymore.
yes, well, not so many. So, anyways, if you're interested in that, then I would say go.
What's
watch
it called
those
again?
lectures. It's called Maps of Meaning.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so it's an attempt to investigate the deepest structures of that particular narrative, and that was something that Carl Jung did. I mean, he devoted his whole life to that, and I think very successfully.